All right, homework 1 is on circles. So we have the equation of a circle that I'm just going to put up on our screen here so that we can reference it. So the whole first half of what you guys are doing is writing equations. There's different sets of information. So center and radius, center and endpoint, both endpoints, or a graph. So you've got multiple different ways that you could be given information and then use that to write the equation of a circle. So these ones are the most straightforward. These ones you could just take H, K, and R and sub them right into the equation. So I'm not going to use those ones. 3 and 4 are a little step up, so we'll go with one of those, and then I can kind of talk you through how you would do 5 through 8. So we're going to do number 3. So we have the center. So the center, 4 and 7, that's going in as your H and your K in this formula right here. And then if you are given an endpoint, what you do is you figure out what the radius would be based on the distance formula. So we had a little reminder of the distance formula in your notes. So instead of using like D equals, we use R equals. And then the radius, that's literally the definition of a radius, is the distance from the center to one of the endpoints of a circle. So square root, in parentheses, you have x2 minus x1. So we're going to take either 4 minus -1 or -1 minus 4. The order doesn't actually matter, because you're squaring it anyway. Plus, and then subtract the y's, 7 minus -2 squared. And we're just going to simplify this up until we figure out what the value of the radius is. So we have, in parentheses, 4 minus -1 would be 5 squared, plus 7 minus -2 is 9 squared. So this, I have 25 plus 81 underneath my square root. And when I add that together, I get 106. That's underneath the square root. So that tells me what my radius is, right? So then I'm going to take all of that information, the H, the K, and now this new value of R, and I'm going to sub it into this formula up here. So I will have X minus H, and that value is 4, close the parentheses, squared, plus Y minus K, which is 7, squared, equals, so now here's the reason why we don't care about simplifying this square root. You have to square it anyway. So like R squared, you take this square root and then you square it and you end up with just 106. All right, so that would be your completed version of this formula. So then the one that you've got right below it, this one, you start with the midpoint formula that we recapped in the notes, and that will get you the center, and then you can do what we just did, choosing either one of these points as the endpoint. You should get the exact same answer either way, assuming that everything's done correctly. And then for graphs, you can pick out, here's the center, and you can either count out the radius, or if it doesn't seem like it's perfectly even, then you could pick an endpoint and do the same way you did any of these formulas. So as long as you just write down, here's the center, here's the radius, or here's an endpoint, then you can do the same technique that you did for any of these. All right, let's look at number 9. Identify the center and the radius, given the equations here. So this, remember these formulas are x minus h and y minus h, so you have to think of what the opposite of this number would be. So x plus 1 is really like having x minus -1. So the center would have a -1 for x, and then same thing here. So think of this as like y minus -4. So it's always the opposite of what you appear to see right here. So it's like these two numbers, except the opposite. And then this, remember, is your r squared. So since that's the square of the radius, you have to take the square root of this number right here. And so the square root of the 81 would be 9. And that's really useful when we do the graphs, like being able to identify, okay, here's the radius, here's what I can do to plot, and how I would plot all the points around the circle. So speaking of which, we are going to do that on the next page. We'll do number 13. So we're going to write the equation in standard form. This is done using the completing the square technique. So we are going to start and see if there's anything that needs to be moved over. So we'll do that first. So the constant should always be by itself on the right-hand side of the equation. So I'm going to add that 5 to both sides. So we have 142 plus 5 would give us 147. Next, see if there's a GCF or a constant or something that you can divide out. So 147 does happen to be divisible by 3. So we can divide every single one of these values by 3. All right, so this right now ends up being divide this by 3, divide this by 3, and when you divide the 147 by 3, you end up with 49. So this one actually is now in standard form. With 14 and 15, you're going to have to do a little bit more work, do some of the completing the square steps in order to get this in its standard form. So let me actually, I want to make sure that you see me do that. So let's do number 14. So sorry, as soon as I started this, I didn't realize we wouldn't have to do completing the square. So this one, let's start by getting everything related to x and y on the left, the constant on the right. So we're going to subtract this y. So 13y minus y leaves us with 12y, and then we're going to leave the negative 32 by itself on the other side. So we are looking at this x squared is all by itself, so we know when the equation is all said and done, the x squared is just going to be all alone. So that means that the x coordinate of the center would be 0. Now this is what we look at next. So this is our middle term. And remember, you take that middle term, you cut it in half. So half of the 12 would be 6. And when I square 6, I get 36. So we can add that value to both sides of the equation. So this is what our next step will look like. So we have this 12y. We figured out what completes the square, so we add that to the left. And then to balance, we are also going to add it to the right, like that. Okay, so now I mentioned this x squared was alone, so it's the only thing we have for x's. For y's, this is now a perfect square trinomial. So you take that perfect square trinomial and you factor it down. So multiplying to 36, adding to 12 would be 6 and 6. So I can write it as a factor squared, like that. And on the right-hand side, just combine those values up. So this is our equation in standard form. That's part of the answer. And then once it's in that standard form, you want to identify the center and the radius and then graph. So the center is these two values. Remember, if there's nothing written in here with the x, it's technically a 0. And this, since you have y plus 6, it would be a negative 6. All right, and then the radius, this is the radius squared. So you take the square root of that number, and that would be 2. So go over to our center. So 0, negative 6 would be down 2, 4, 6 right here. And then our radius is 2. So you go 2 units in every direction. And once you have that, then you just connect the dots and make your circle.